Hello, and welcome to our 2032 presidential election coverage. This evening, we'll be covering the primary elections themselves, as the candidates who have made it through this long and grueling primary season are now facing their first test as voters decide whether to cast their ballots for each candidate. Let's get right into some polling for the Democratic primary. Kamala Harris still leads the pack at 20%, but she's now tied with Stacey Abrams, governor of Georgia. Meanwhile, Joe Kennedy III, senator of Massachusetts, has third place with 16%, and former governor of Kentucky Andy Beshear has risen up to 15%, about a 5% increase since the last poll was taken. Meanwhile, former Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg has dropped down to 10% and fourth place. There's a large gap in between him and the next few candidates, which are Tulsi Gabbard at 4%, Gavin Newsom, and Anna Eskamani at 1%. And we also have two more candidates, Cori Bush and Gretchen Whitmer, at 1% each. Meanwhile, in the Iowa caucus, Andy Beshear takes the lead, doing very well with many rural Democrats, some also ancestral Democrats who are still part of the Democratic Party, surprisingly, and are willing to vote for him. 1% behind him is Joe Kennedy III, and about 10% behind both of them is Kamala Harris, and about 3% behind him is Pete Buttigieg. Meanwhile, in New Hampshire, Pete Buttigieg is a lot better. He's tied for first with Joe Kennedy III. Joe Kennedy III doing very well in New England with a lot more liberal voters. He was endorsed by Elizabeth Warren, meaning a lot of progressive voters are actually going to him instead of someone like Kamala Harris or Stacey Abrams. And in Nevada, Stacey Abrams and Kamala Harris take the top two in this one. Harris has nearly 30%, and Stacey Abrams has about 22%. And in South Carolina, another lead for these two candidates, but Kamala Harris has actually reached 30%, and Stacey Abrams at 25%, and there's about a 10% gap in between them and the next few candidates. Meanwhile, for the Republican Party, Adam Kinzinger still pulls at 1%, almost 95% behind the incumbent president, Ron DeSantis. So now we have our poll closings out of Iowa, the Iowa caucus that is, and we now have a major projection to make. Andy Beshear will win the Iowa Democratic caucus. Let's check out the extended results. As you can see, he will win 26.8% of the vote over Joe Kennedy's 24.3%. That's about 3,000 raw votes. And as you can see, Andy Beshear swept pretty much most of the counties, especially the rural ones, but he had good numbers in the suburban ones as well, and that is where he got most of his votes. On the extended list, you can see that he got 11 delegates to Joe Kennedy III's 10 delegates. Meanwhile, Kamala Harris and Stacey Abrams lag behind at 7 delegates and 6 delegates each. Meanwhile, Pete Buttigieg got 12% and 5 delegates, a pretty good performance, but the rest of the candidates only got around 2% or 1 delegate, and some did not even get any delegates at all. Meanwhile, Ron DeSantis will easily sweep the Iowa Republican caucus. There's almost no contest between him and Adam Kinzinger. As you can see, he got 99% of the vote in all 40 delegates. Meanwhile, Adam Kinzinger got 1% and not a single delegate. Here is the current primary map. Andy Beshear has a 1 delegate lead over Joe Kennedy III. And a major projection to make. Ron DeSantis will win the Republican primary. He's now the projected winner, and this is because of one major announcement we have coming up. Adam Kinzinger is exiting the 2032 primary race. This is because of his abysmal Iowa performance, and that leaves DeSantis with no primary challenger, meaning that he is now the presumptive nominee. Whitmer, Bush, and Newsom all have left the presidential race. Of course, it is Gretchen Whitmer, Cori Bush, and Gavin Newsom. All of them got either no delegate or about 1% of the vote in Iowa, meaning that they don't really have a pathway to victory. That means that they are leaving the race now. Same thing with Anna Eskamani and Tulsi Gabbard. These are two kind of surprising candidates, as both of them did win delegates in the race, but they really haven't been getting as much media attention, meaning that they would need to have a very big break to get any delegates in the next primaries, which isn't very likely, so they're suspending their campaigns. And we're polling for the New Hampshire primary. Currently, Joe Kennedy III and Andy Beshear are tied at 22%. Pete Buttigieg has dropped out of the top 4, now in 5th place. Meanwhile, Kamala Harris and Stacey Abrams take 3rd and 4th respectively. And we have our poll closing out of the New Hampshire primary, and a major projection to make. Joe Kennedy III will triumph the New Hampshire Democratic primary. As you can see, he won with 29.1% of the vote over Andy Beshear's 25%. In raw votes, he beat out Beshear by about 10%. 10,000 votes, not 10%. As you can see, Kennedy did very well in the eastern, more populous portions of the state, while Andy Beshear remained competitive in the rural areas like Coos County that are traditionally Republican in the presidential election, and in the western portions of the state. As you can see, Kennedy triumphed with 7 delegates compared to Beshear's 6, and of course it just went down from there, Kamala Harris getting 5 and Abrams getting 4. And meanwhile, a bigger drop from here, Pete Buttigieg got a mere 2 delegates. And here's the current primary map. It is now tied 18-18 with Beshear and Kennedy. Meanwhile, these are the only 2 candidates to win a single state. Of course, Abrams and Harris are lagging behind at 10 delegates for Abrams and 12 for Harris. Pete Buttigieg has dropped out of the presidential race and surprisingly endorsed Kamala Harris. He has been pretty close with her politically since they both served in the Jon Ossoff administration. This is a very interesting alliance, as Buttigieg was expected to endorse another young, slightly liberal Democrat like Andy Beshear or Joe Kennedy. This is definitely a boost for Harris, which could help her later on. Here is a polling for the Nevada primary. Kamala Harris has reached 30% in the polls, Stacey Abrams at 25%. That should be Joe Kennedy at 15%, tied with Andy Beshear, not Pete Buttigieg. And we were poll closing at the Nevada primary. We have a major projection to make. Kamala Harris will win the Nevada Democratic primary, sweeping the state. As you can see, she surpassed 30% of the vote, getting an exact 30.5%. Meanwhile, Stacey Abrams only got 25% as expected. That is about a difference of 4,000 raw votes. As you can see, Andy Beshear swept all the rural areas, while Kamala Harris won in Clark County, the biggest county in the state, which essentially guaranteed her victory. Joe Kennedy III did well in a few of the counties that actually Pete Buttigieg did well in back in the 2020 primary and 2024 primary, but it was not enough. As you can see, Stacey Abrams took second, doing very well in Reno and Las Vegas. So here are the extended results. Kamala Harris with 11 delegates, Abrams with 9, and both Kennedy and Beshear with 8 delegates. Here's the current primary map, still tied between Beshear and Kennedy, but Kamala Harris has risen up fast. She's now 2 delegates behind the 2 frontrunners. And here is a polling for the South Carolina primary. Kamala Harris has dropped down at 28%, Abrams at 24%. The real test here is to see if Stacey Abrams can win a primary. She's gotten good performances so far, but that hasn't gained her any media attention or additional support. South Carolina, ever since 2020, has been the state of comebacks. Joe Biden, losing, won it, and he came back to sweep Super Tuesday. Jon Ossoff, for him, it sealed the deal for his nomination. After he won South Carolina, Kamala Harris was essentially done for. Meanwhile, Nikki Haley, in the same 2024 primary but on the Republican side, won the state to revitalize her campaign and eventually take the nomination over Ron DeSantis. Same thing in 2028, Nikki Haley won it and gave DeSantis a run for his money in the eventual primary race. So we'll see if Stacey Abrams can win the state nonetheless. And a major projection out of the South Carolina Democratic primary. Stacey Abrams will triumph in the South Carolina Democratic primary, beating out her opponents. As you can see, she has won with 35% of the vote, vastly exceeding expectations. She wins about, there's a difference of raw votes, about 47,000 in between Kamala Harris and Stacey Abrams. As you can see, Abrams did very, very well in Charleston and Columbia, the 2 major cities. A lot of minority turnout has gained her the win. And on the extended delegate list, she has 5 more delegates than the next closest candidate, of course that being Kamala Harris, 19 delegates to 14. And there's a slight drop-off where Beshear has 11 and Kennedy has 10. And of course that means delegates, not percent of the vote. And here's the current primary map. Kamala Harris, surprisingly, now has 40 delegates, while Andy Beshear has 39. Meanwhile, Kennedy and Abrams are both tied at 38, meaning that going into the Super Tuesday primary, this is really anyone's game. All candidates have some form of momentum behind them, meaning that the nominee could really be any of these 4 candidates. Here's a plan for the Democratic primary. Kamala Harris's lead has grown to 25%, but now Andy Beshear is in second place, just 1% behind. Meanwhile, Stacey Abrams has 22% and Joe Kennedy has 20%. And we have our Super Tuesday poll closing out of a large batch of states, not just New Hampshire, of course. There are some big states like California, Texas, North Carolina, Virginia, and Minnesota all up for grabs this evening. And we can project the Alabama primary will go to Stacey Abrams. We can also project the Arkansas primary going to Stacey Abrams, two very southern states where Abrams is doing very well. And American Samoa will give its delegates to Kamala Harris. Meanwhile, in California, Kamala Harris will sweep in a landslide victory, winning San Francisco and much of the Bay Area, as well as Los Angeles. Meanwhile, Andy Beshear will do very well in suburban and rural California, while Joe Kennedy will do well on the coastal areas like Monterey and Ventura, and Stacey Abrams is doing surprisingly well in San Diego and Orange County. And the Colorado primary will go to Andy Beshear. He will triumph over his opponents in Colorado. And in May, another New England state going for Joe Kennedy. In Massachusetts, Kennedy will win this state in a landslide. He is very popular here, as were many of his relatives with the Kennedy name. In Minnesota, Andy Beshear will win this Rust Belt-ish state. He will do very well in the rural and suburban areas and triumph by a very large margin. In North Carolina, Kamala Harris will narrowly beat out Stacey Abrams, adding another southern state to her column. This state was highly contested by both candidates, so it's a big win for Kamala Harris. Meanwhile, Oklahoma will give its delegates to Andy Beshear, another rural state giving its delegates to the populist Democrat. And in Tennessee, a state that Andy Beshear tried very hard to win, will go to Kamala Harris nonetheless, a big win for her. And in Texas, a massive win for Andy Beshear. He was endorsed by Beto O'Rourke, a very major figure in Democratic politics here. Kamala Harris will get 25% of the vote simply out of Dallas and Houston, very major urban areas. But Stacey Abrams has also done very well, winning the counties that hold Austin, San Antonio, and Houston. But Andy Beshear will sweep almost every single rural county and do very well in suburban areas, so that means that he will win with about 148,000 votes. In Utah, Joe Kennedy will win the primary here. And in Vermont, another New England state going to Kennedy. And in Virginia, Andy Beshear will win this state. Meanwhile, the Democrats abroad will give their delegates to Kennedy, the Democrats not currently in the country, and will surprisingly give their delegates to Joe Kennedy III. Here is the current primary map. Kamala Harris has a pretty large lead with about 484 delegates, compared to Andy Beshear's 394. Joe Kennedy lags very far behind with 313, and Stacey Abrams has about 308. We now have poll closings out of Mini Super Tuesday, a lot of large states such as Washington, Michigan, and Missouri. We can project the Idaho primary will easily go to Andy Beshear, and Michigan will also go to Andy Beshear. He will win this state in a landslide. His next closest competitor will be Joe Kennedy III, doing very well with a lot of affluent white voters compared to Beshear's working class vote coalition. Meanwhile, Mississippi will give its delegates to Kamala Harris, as opposed to Stacey Abrams. This is a big win for Harris, as Abrams was expected to win the state. And in Missouri, Andy Beshear will also easily sweep the state, doing very well with a lot of ancestral Democrats. And in North Dakota, another easy win for Andy Beshear. The momentum definitely seems to be on his side. In Washington primary, Kamala Harris will triumph over her opponents in a big win in the state of Washington. Now the delegates shake out to be 594 for Harris and 524 for Beshear. Joe Kennedy lags pretty far behind at 395, and Abrams even farther behind with 351. Stacey Abrams did not win a single state of this evening, neither did Kennedy, but Abrams was expected to win some like Mississippi. Kennedy wasn't really expected to win any, and just simply had good performances that gained him delegates nonetheless. Stacey Abrams has ended her presidential run and endorsed the former Vice President Kamala Harris. Very big news, as Abrams wasn't doing great, but it was expected to get a lot of the southern vote, in those vote-rich areas that could now benefit Kamala Harris. And now, here is the polling for the Democratic primary. Kamala Harris has 35%, getting a lot of Stacey Abrams' support. Meanwhile, Andy Beshear has 30%, and Joe Kennedy III has 25%. Not a lot of undecided voters, but of course those voters will decide how this race shakes out. And we now have poll closings out of 3 massive states: Arizona, Florida, and Illinois. A lot of candidates have made statements on the results of these states that will be to come. Joe Kennedy says that his campaign needs to win 2 states for him not to drop out. Andy Beshear is looking to win essentially all 3, same with Kamala Harris. But of course, Kennedy is really the one who is on the chopping block this evening. If he does not win any states, his campaign is essentially done for. If he wins one state, he has a chance, and if he wins two, he's definitely back in the race. We can project that Arizona will go to Kamala Harris. She will triumph by about 75,000 votes over Andy Beshear, doing very well in the Phoenix area. Meanwhile, she will also triumph in Florida, a far smaller margin, but about 45,000 votes, but she will triumph nonetheless. Andy Beshear sweeping all the rural areas, while Kamala Harris does well in Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach, and Kennedy does well in the white affluent areas like the Tampa Bay area and St. Lucie and Duval counties. And in Illinois, Andy Beshear easily wins the state, sweeping the suburban and rural areas. His next closest competitor was 11% down, and of course that was Joe Kennedy. He'll win the state by about 100,000 votes. And here is the current primary map. Kamala Harris at 736 delegates and Andy Beshear at 688. We have some big news. Joe Kennedy III has dropped out of the race and endorsed Andy Beshear. This was expected as Kennedy did not win a single state up for grabs that last evening, and of course his endorsement of Beshear makes sense as they're both quite closely politically aligned. That means a lot more white, affluent, progressive, suburban voters, that's a lot of adjectives, will be going to Andy Beshear, which could help him win the nomination over Kamala Harris. And here's the current primary map adjusting for endorsement. We're adding all the dropped out candidates who have endorsed anyone to the current totals. That means Andy Beshear actually takes the lead with 1,218 delegates, and Kamala Harris has just over 1,000. And we now have poll closings out of Wisconsin. We can project this state's delegate count now. Andy Beshear will easily win the Wisconsin primary. He will sweep the driftless region and do very well in the suburban areas that were expected to go to Joe Kennedy. Kamala Harris has had an abysmal performance, and while you can't see the county map, it is truly shocking how poorly she has done in the state. In Alaska, we have another projection to make. Andy Beshear will easily win the Alaska Democratic primary, doing very well with populist Democrats. And in Wyoming, a very small state, not sure if it totally exists, but nonetheless, Andy Beshear will win it. That is 3 primaries in a row that Andy Beshear has swept. And out of Ohio, the biggest state that we've seen so far. This is a big test. Andy Beshear is widely expected to win this state, but Kamala Harris definitely has a chance. Remember, someone like Hillary Clinton could win this primary back in 2016, so Kamala Harris has invested a lot of ground game into this area. And in a shocking upset, Kamala Harris will win the Ohio Democratic primary. Andy Beshear's camp is completely shocked. This puts momentum back on Kamala Harris after losing so many primaries in a row. She will narrowly win the Ohio Democratic primary only by under 1%. And here's a primary map. Kamala Harris has taken the lead with 1,352 delegates, compared to Andy Beshear's 1,218. This looks like it could go to a brokered convention. It is so close. We'll see if one of these candidates drops out in the name of party unity and endorses the other. And with poll closings out of Kansas, and no surprise, Andy Beshear will triumph in this Democratic primary. And in Nebraska, another rural state, no surprise here, Andy Beshear wins the Nebraska Democratic primary with almost no contention from Kamala Harris. And out of Oregon, a Pacific Coast state, Andy Beshear trying to win over a lot of suburban voters compared to Kamala Harris, who's trying to boost up her margins in the Portland area. And Kamala Harris will win the Oregon primary, triumphing over Andy Beshear, a key win for her in this primary. And out of Hawaii, an easy win for Kamala Harris, doing very well with minority voters here. And we have a poll closing out of with the largest batch of states since Mini Super Tuesday, almost a month or 2 months ago. A lot of states like Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Maryland up for grabs this evening. Andy Beshear has been contending a lot of the New England states, in addition to the rural states like New Mexico, South Dakota, and Montana, and the more populated states like Indiana and Pennsylvania. But what I meant to say was that he was contesting a lot of New England states due to his support from Joe Kennedy III. If he wins most of these states this evening, Kamala Harris's campaign is done. We can project that Kamala Harris will win Delaware Democratic primary, triumphing over Andy Beshear by a larger than expected margin. It's not like Joe Biden endorsed her, but her being on the ticket back in 2020 has gained her a lot of support from loyal Democrats. She will also easily win the Washington, D.C. primary. No surprise here. And Kamala Harris will surprisingly triumph in the Indiana Democratic primary. A massive shock. Andy Beshear was widely expected to win here, not even by a close margin. But Kamala Harris' support from Pete Buttigieg definitely was what sealed the deal. turnout from South Bend was what decided the race, and of course minority support from Indianapolis. The Andy Beshear camp is currently in shock and disbelief. Meanwhile, Andy Beshear will easily win the Montana Democratic primary, and Kamala Harris will triumph the New Mexico Democratic primary, and she will also shockingly win the Pennsylvania Democratic primary with support from people like Connor Lamb. This is what really is going to give Kamala Harris the lead going into the convention. States like Pennsylvania is shockingly going to her instead of Beshear. We'll see if Andy Beshear has any words on whether he'll drop out after this. Meanwhile, Rhode Island will also give its delegates to Kamala Harris, no surprise here. And South Dakota will surprisingly give its delegates to Kamala Harris. The state is more establishmentarian than a lot of other rural states, so not a massive surprise, even though we said that. Here's the current primary map. Kamala Harris has 1,441 delegates, compared to Andy Beshear's 1,620. If Andy Beshear won Indiana and Pennsylvania, he essentially would be the presumptive nominee by now, but he didn't and failed to win those states, meaning that this could go on and on till the end of the primary season, which would of course be the convention. And this would be very bad for the Democrats if they couldn't decide on a nominee before July. We now have our poll closing out of 2 states. Georgia, a state which Kamala Harris is trying to win by a very large margin given her endorsement by Stacey Abrams. And West Virginia, a very rural state in which Joe Manchin, its former Democratic senator, has endorsed Andy Beshear. We project Georgia will easily go to Kamala Harris, a massive win for her this evening. But West Virginia will easily go to Beshear, no surprise here. And here's the current map. Andy Beshear has 1,620 delegates, compared to Kamala Harris's 1,441. There are only a few states up that are still left up, and 2 of them have their poll closing soon, Kentucky and New York. Both candidates have agreed that the winner of that, essentially an informal agreement, if the candidate that wins New York by the largest margin will essentially be the nominee, since that is the most populated state left up. Kentucky is widely expected to go to Andy Beshear. He's super popular there. Andy Beshear will easily win the Kentucky Democratic primary, and next up is the New York Democratic primary. We'll see who will win. And Kamala Harris will triumph in the New York Democratic primary by a far larger than expected margin. She will do very, very well in New York City, exceeding expectations. Kamala Harris will triumph in the New York Democratic primary, and Andy Beshear will have essentially an abysmal performance, only getting support from the upstate areas. And here's the current map. Kamala Harris has now surpassed the number of delegates needed, 2,000, to win the Democratic primary. The official number is 1,991, but Kamala Harris has won nonetheless. It is super close, but Andy Beshear has actually just stated, and this is some breaking news, that he will drop out and endorse Kamala Harris. So, interestingly enough, he's taking himself out of the running for the VP choice, potentially setting himself up for a run if Kamala Harris loses in 2036. And now we have a major projection to make. This is one you've all seen coming, or maybe not, but of course, we'll see what it is. Kamala Harris is the projected winner of the Democratic primary in 2032. She will triumph over not only Andy Beshear, but a ton of other candidates like Stacey Abrams, Joe Kennedy III, Pete Buttigieg, Anna Eskamani, and Tulsi Gabbard. Harris has triumphed in the Democratic primary and will go on to face Ron DeSantis in the general election, so stay tuned for coverage of that. So, now you can choose Kamala Harris's VP. Check out the link in the description or the pinned comment, whichever is there first, to choose who Kamala Harris's running mate will be. There are a list of options. You can also add other if you want, but of course, you do you. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like so it can help spread around YouTube. Subscribe to see more of my content like this. Leave a comment telling me what you thought of the video. That'd definitely help. So, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all